Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Learn with Flo. If you guys have been following along with our September series here, I'm going to be building off our conversation of last week where we dove into the ins and outs, some of the hype and the hazards behind this wonderful topic of functional lab testing. So if you were with us last week, we got to really take a nuanced approach, which is always my favorite, right? Living in the gray area, knowing how we can kind of, like I said, navigate multiple different truths at the same time. What a novel idea in 2023. But around the functional lab testing side of things, where we can use them as a huge jumping off point for a lot of people's progress, but also where we can get into the weeds of some template medicine, some cookie cutter approaches, or really similar to just kind of duping the pill for every ill model of conventional medicine, only in a functional medicine approach. So that's where we got to have a great conversation last week. If you were with us, if you didn't, go back and catch that one, because we're definitely going to refer to a lot of different topics from that conversation in today's topic as well too. So you guys submitted a lot of follow-up feedback and a lot of great questions from that, because I know that the world of functional testing and functional medicine is really getting a time in the sun, which I love to see. But I also want to warn people just about how that side of medicine can also kind of fall under the same umbrella as conventional medicine if we're not careful about it, or if we don't really know what to look for, right? So that's where I want these conversations to be able to ebb and flow, because these are the same type of topics that I cover a lot of times behind the scenes with the people that I get to work more closely with in a one-on-one setting. So I take a lot of those conversations and try to bring them to you guys so that we can have a platform to really dive in deeper and not just have like an Instagram carousel post about it or a quick story soundbite about it, but more like what is the deeper behind the scenes conversations that we can have, so that we can have more nuanced conversations just like this as well too. So building on the idea of our functional testing, we can use the functional testing in a really, really positive way to help come to the table with more root cause solutions. Remember, with functional medicine, unlike conventional medicine, we're not using functional testing for diagnostic measures. We don't care. We're not here to put a label on it, because that's more of a conventional medicine approach of using foundational labs like blood work. They are running the blood work to look for something diagnosable, right? And that diagnosis can then lead them to a certain prescription or a certain treatment program or things like that. So know that the functional side of things is going to be very different. We're not looking for something that's diagnostic. We're looking for root causes here, and we're looking for connections to help really explain their overall story, right? So it's not the same, it's not on the same level as a diagnostic test. I don't care to look at diagnoses. I'm using functional labs to help fill in the gaps where conventional medicine wasn't there to really help, because maybe our conventional labs look normal, even though our symptoms are very much not normal. So that's where digging into some of the functional testing can be so helpful and so vital for that particular reason. Which then leads into our conversation today of, when we use some of these functional testing, what are we looking for? Why are we using it? And aside from just trying to give individuals that have been kind of failed by a conventional medicine approach a different avenue, we also want to use these to help determine someone's unique metabolic phenotype. And a metabolic phenotype, if you don't know what it is, I wouldn't expect you to know what it is, because it really is kind of a term that, at least to my knowledge, I'm the only one really talking about it or using that particular term, because this is what we use to describe a unique hormonal profile that's associated with each and every individual person. You would be maybe surprised, but maybe not surprised to hear that I see a lot of individuals that come to me with very common underlying symptoms, right? Maybe it's fatigue, maybe it's sugar cravings, maybe it's uncontrollable appetite, maybe it's no appetite, maybe it's hair loss or hair thinning or constipation or IBS type symptoms, food sensitivities, menstrual cycle irregularities, infertility issues, weight changes, body composition goals. I mean, you name it, right? It runs the gamut. But ironically enough, I could have 5 people come in with all the 5 same symptoms, but all 5 of them having very different metabolic phenotypes. So when I refer to and talk about metabolic phenotypes, it's really just a term or a concept that I use to discuss with individuals their unique picture. Underneath the hood, what is that picture that's contributing to your particular symptoms, right? Because it's one of those where 2 people could have the same symptoms, but 2 different reasons of why they have those symptoms. For example, let's take brain fog, right? Brain fog could be classically associated with like a low testosterone type picture, and it's also associated with like high blood sugars and insulin resistance because it's a sign of like neuroinflammation in the brain, right? So it's like, oh, so those are 2 like very different conversations and treatment strategies for those people. Yes, we have to know like your particular metabolic phenotype, or we're not going to get very far in our overall treatment strategy. And that's why people out there are really falling through the cracks, because they are just being given a box, right? And we have to stop trying to put people in a particular box. It's like, oh, you go here. This is your box. Therefore, this is your XYZ treatment plan. And if you don't respond to XYZ treatment plan, then I don't have a box for you, right? So it's like we have to ditch this idea of boxes for people, because that just plays into more of that like one size fits all cookie cutter approach, template medicine that unfortunately, I know that conventional medicine is known for that now. A lot of people are kind of becoming privy to that it's like, oh yeah, in that conventional medicine model, if my labs kind of look normal, I get put into a box. Like, oh, well, your symptoms line up with IBS, so we're just going to call it IBS. And it's like, yeah, okay, but what do I do about it? They're like, well, you could take this, but there's not really a conversation of why, right? Where did those IBS symptoms come from? What's the underlying root cause, right? Which is where functional medicine really can shine. Although functional medicine, let's be real, the more and more that I'm in this space, I also see the same stupid cookie cutter template, one size fits all approaches happening in a functional medicine space as well too. That's what I'm not about. That's what I want to kind of like have a conversation about, because I think it's becoming more and more common. Why do I think it's happening? Separate soapbox speech, but I do think it's because of the same limitations that happened in the conventional medicine model. Time, right? We're just practitioners' time, and also money, right? So it is one of those models where it's like it is easier. You can see and churn and burn more people if you just put everybody into the same box and you just ascribe to one treatment program. Everybody follows the same diet, the same supplementation, the same lifestyle. Here's your recommendations. Here's your box. Go do, which is great because that might work for 40% of the people, but what about the other 60% of people that are like, I don't fit in your box, right? That is the concept of more of like a cookie cutter template medicine. And those people are just then made to feel as if like they're the problem. They're broken, the protocol didn't work for them, or they didn't do it hard enough, or they didn't do it good enough. And it's like, is that true? Or was that just not their box and you put them into a place where they didn't belong? So I keep using this concept of a box, but it really goes back to, are we respecting everybody's unique metabolic phenotype when we're starting to create different recommendations and different treatment strategies? And I will say that, yes, does that require a practitioner who understands a variety of different metabolic phenotypes and also understands like how the body works as a whole and becomes a little bit of an investigator with you into digging into that for your body? Yeah, it does. And there's not every practitioner that's really interested in doing that level. They just want to create like boxes and then distribute said boxes. But I think that more than anything, especially in today's world, with all of the different environmental changes and food changes and lifestyle stressors, it's like, I don't very often find people that really fit into like one box and can just ascribe the same thing to everybody, because everybody's body is responding differently to all of these different changes, right? So not only do I think that putting people in a box is a disservice to them, I also feel like it's downright negligent and dangerous, because really what's appropriate for one person could be detrimental to another person. So the reality of the matter is, right, we talked about this functional testing last week. We talked about kind of the hype and the hazards of that and how it can create kind of this like cookie cutter template model. And then this week we're going to talk about, it's like, okay, but where could we dive in and use this functional testing in the right way? And how does that also help us as consumers of all of this health information be able to discover and decipher like what is right for me? That's probably the biggest question and one of the biggest motivational pieces of doing this conversation with you guys today was really just understanding like, hey, I get asked the question all the time, like, Lauren, how do I filter through all of the different like health and nutrition advice that's out there? Like one person says this, another person says that, and they are like seemingly totally two opposing ideas. Like, who's right? Like, how do you filter through that? I literally had this question asked to me by a current client just this last week. And so that I was like, I wrote that down because I'm like, she's not wrong. Like that is a very real hurdle for a lot of people. And we got to then have a conversation around like, okay, the advice and the guidance that I'm giving you is according to your metabolic phenotype, right? So that's how we filter through a lot of this information out there, is we first have to understand what's true for us, what's right for us. And we can't really answer that question until we understand that there's a multitude of different metabolic phenotypes out there, and each one of them is going to require a different individualized approach. And that's okay. That is totally okay. And your approach might change with different seasons of life because your metabolic phenotype might change in different seasons of life, right? So it's not this like one size fits all approach. I think that it just does people a disservice, not only physically, but also mentally, because it puts them into that shame spiral. If it doesn't work for them, they end up like feeling shameful, feeling guilty, feeling like they're the problem and there's something about their body that's broken and why they didn't respond to that, versus letting them know like, oh no, that was just one box or one phenotype. If you didn't fit in that, that's okay. There's others. We just need to do some digging to figure that out. So just on a broad spectrum scope, let's start to talk about some examples of different metabolic phenotypes so you guys can kind of wrap your mind around what I'm considering here. So when I think about different metabolic phenotypes, a lot of these could present with the same symptoms, right? It could present with digestive issues. It could present with anxiety. It could present with hair loss or energy or menstrual cycle irregularities. But if we don't know your metabolic phenotype, then we might not give you the right strategy for that. So the reason why I like to use different labs and functional lab testing is to help people determine like, hey, what's your unique metabolic phenotype? Are we dealing with a phenotype of blood sugar highs? That's kind of a specific phenotype. It's like, ooh, yeah, I'm really struggling. I have chronic blood sugar highs. My hemoglobin A1C is high. My fasting insulin levels are high. My triglycerides are high. It's like, okay, that is a metabolic phenotype. Or are we someone that's struggling with like blood sugar lows, right? My blood sugar is low. I'm getting a lot of anxiety. I'm getting a lot of panic attacks, trouble falling asleep, trouble staying asleep, a lot of, cortisol imbalances. It's like, okay, you're struggling with like blood sugar lows, which is a completely different metabolic phenotype. Would I give both of those individuals the same treatment plan? Hell no, because they are two totally different phenotypes, right? Even if some of their symptoms overlap. I see people all the time come in with blood sugar highs and they have trouble changing their body composition. And I have people that struggle with blood sugar lows who are also struggling with their body composition. Same picture, two different strategies. And that's what I want to, like I said, kind of key you guys into here. Or it could be someone that's coming in and they have like full-blown insulin resistance. Or is it someone that's coming in and they have more of like a leptin resistance pattern? Am I seeing someone that has like a high cortisol picture, or is this someone that has like a low cortisol picture? Again, two different treatment strategies. How about someone that comes in with like a high estrogen picture Or maybe it's not a high estrogen, but it's more of a low progesterone picture, which is presenting as high estrogen. Again, two very different treatment strategies. So you guys are kind of getting the gist here. Same thing where you kind of dig in and it's like, are some of these symptoms being driven by sluggish liver detoxification? Are these being driven by, stagnant drainage detox pathways? Like all of these different things is like, what is your unique metabolic phenotype? And this is where I think if used correctly, lab testing or functional lab testing can really shine, because we can determine what is that person's unique metabolic phenotype, and therefore we know confidently what type of box they're going to fit into to some degree to get them started. And that way they're not out there spinning their wheels trying to use different strategies and different tools that weren't ever meant for them, right? Let me give you guys some examples, because I love stories. I love case studies. I think that really helps kind of drive things home a little bit. Let's go with the most recent case study that I was just having a conversation with a potential new client last week, who comes to me who has weight loss goals, poor energy, some digestive issues with bloating, constipation, mainly has a PCOS diagnosis, and also is struggling with infertility, right? That's kind of been her MO, throughout her adult life. And with this, we got to kind of discuss, we had labs on her, right? Some initial labs. And with that, we got to discuss the different types of PCOS, right? This was a woman who was in her early 40s. And this was the first time that someone had explained to her that there are different types of PCOS. She's like, yeah, I'm like, there's an insulin resistant type of PCOS, but there's also a cortisol induced PCOS picture with this inflammatory load, right? I go, your labs really don't show evidence of more of like an insulin resistant PCOS picture. So be cautious to, when you're out there Google searching like PCOS diet, PCOS symptoms, PCOS reversal, whatever it is. She's like, oh yeah, like everything that you're discussing is more for someone that has like an insulin resistant PCOS picture. And I'm like, yeah. She's like, that's why I've tried all of those things and none of them have worked for me, because I don't have that picture. I'm like, yes. I'm like, this is the first time like someone was happy to slap a diagnosable label on her in a conventional medicine model, and was like, you have PCOS, right? But they didn't really give her much guidance beyond that. So now here she goes home trying to be an empowered and proactive consumer of her own health. She's out there Googling things for PCOS, comes across a bunch of different strategies of people that are talking about nutrition interventions and lifestyle interventions and this and that. But if she's just navigating down like insulin resistant PCOS, the poor woman has been out there trying to fast, do keto, do all of this HIIT training, all of those things definitely lining up with like an insulin resistant pattern. The woman isn't insulin resistant. So she's like been doing all of these things for years and not seeing any success. I'm like, yes, that's because like nobody has explained to you like what your metabolic phenotype is. And this is not going to be like an insulin resistant PCOS picture. This is more of a cortisol induced PCOS picture, which are two different strategies. And she's like, oh, okay. Like wrapping my mind around that. Perfect example of where she didn't have a strong understanding of her metabolic phenotype, and it led her down a whole road of different Band-Aid solutions or trying different strategies that just didn't fit her picture. And so she had come to the table with carrying a lot of that, feeling like there was something wrong with her. And we got to have that discussion and be like, no, that makes sense because you were just trying tools that didn't fit your picture, right? Another classic story. This was actually a story from the gal who kind of originally prompted this or asked me this question. So recently started working with another client who came to me with like extreme fatigue, lots of irritability, lots of anxiety, again, fertility concerns, had 2 miscarriages. They weren't really planned, but had 2 miscarriages. And she's like, that's kind of wild. And she was previously very outdoorsy, very active, and now was like her energy, she couldn't even hardly get out of bed most days, right? So through functional lab testing, we found for her, yes, she did have a significant case of some HPA axis dysregulation, like AKA like adrenal fatigue type picture. And she was also struggling with some reactive hypoglycemia or blood sugar lows, right? So we used functional lab testing to kind of figure out like what is her metabolic phenotype, and then we got to come to the table and talk about like lifestyle supplementation strategies. And when we got to the conversation around nutrition, this woman was already living gluten-free, dairy-free, sourcing everything organic, locally sourced, grass-fed, grass-finished, like had a lot of knowledge about like quality of food nutrition, right? And so she was kind of like shocked to hear that she was like, you know, in the state that she was, because there was a lot of like nutritional gaps that we needed to fill, right? And she was previously kind of under the impression, just because of more of her self-research, she had gotten really into more of the plant-based approaches, right? For longevity, for overall like gut health and things like that. I'm like, that's cool. That's super valid. And I do think that like a plant forward diet for certain metabolic phenotypes absolutely works. But for you, if you're in a state of like adrenal fatigue, adrenal exhaustion, plants, AKA all of the vegetables that you're eating, and her appetite already sucks. She's like, I'm hardly ever hungry. I'm like, well, yeah, because like everything's just so, your body's trying to conserve energy resources at all costs. So you're kind of like using up this stomach real estate for all of these vegetables that, yeah, they have great micronutrients in them, but there is no energy density there to fuel our mitochondria and our adrenals and all of this jazz. And so part of our conversations was like, I wanted her to like pull back on her vegetable intake so that she could make room for like more carb sources and some more diversity of like proteins and some more fats in there to stabilize her blood sugars. So it was like, of course, is there like, are plant-based diets bad? Hell no. And she was the one that was like, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense when you explain it like that. She's like, so like the plant-based diets and things like that I'm following and reading about, they're not bad. They're just not like for my metabolic phenotype right now. I'm like, exactly. They're not going to get you to where you want to be continuing to eat that way. And that's okay. Like just coming to the day, and she was super willing, once you kind of understand the why, to understand like she needs to focus on like a well-resourced and a very energized body, and the plant-based diet she was doing just ain't it, right? So we got to kind of talk about that. And then I think another, like I said, classic example that I can share with you too would be, because I see this kind of phenotype quite a bit as well too, would be another client that came to me. She was dealing with chronic constipation, hair thinning, hair loss, even some eczema, a lot of bloating, and a ton of food sensitivities. So in my world, I can probably pretty much tell you already, even if I see kind of that picture, very classically, the first question I always ask is like, are you counting macros? And they're like, how did you know? I'm like, I can tell kind of like what that metabolic phenotype starts to look like of individuals that get really wrapped around nutrition in terms of like calories and macros, and kind of what that can do downstream if we're not careful about what that really looks like or entails, right? Or if we're always like intentionally trying to eat in a calorie deficit, like that's not what our body was designed to do. And it kind of actually really hates that, especially your female body, right? So she had a long history of macro counting and kind of like playing that rigmarole of like always seeking body composition change. And through functional testing, we found, to kind of no surprise, but a high cortisol picture for her, contrary to the last client who we found a low cortisol picture, right? So high cortisol picture, poor digestive capacity and low stomach acid, low immune function and low beneficial bacteria. And so this was a person that was already eating high protein. She was eating gluten-free. She was counting all her macros. She was tracking all her calories. But she was like shocked then to hear that I wanted her to start like ignoring calories, ignoring macros, and focusing on when she's eating and what she's eating, because she was definitely eating like gluten-free, but she wasn't eating like naturally gluten-free, right? She was eating more of like gluten-free crackers, gluten-free breads, like things that were like macro friendly, or like a crap ton of popcorn. I was like, that's like classic diet culture has really fed us into like high volume meals that aren't a lot of calories. And I'm like, how is that working for you, right? Probably not well, especially in a long-term sense. So I wanted her to like start to ignore the calories and macros and pull in like when and what she's eating. We talked about nixing some of the powders, right? The protein powders and the protein shakes and things like that she was relying on, and starting to increase her plant intake from like nuts and seeds and fruits and vegetable, like getting in more of that plant diversity because she had low beneficial bacteria. Like that phenotype needs abundance and diversity, and like macro counting and protein shakes and eating the same meal on repeat because like it's macro friendly and you've calculated it out and you know exactly like how much it is, so I just eat it on repeat. Like, I'm sorry, like macro counting and calorie count, they're not bad, but they just ain't it for her metabolic phenotype of trying to work on her gut health, right? I could give you guys hundreds of different examples like that, but it's really just starting to get your guys' brains spinning into like, oh, so this functional testing that you talked about, or even to some degree some conventional testing too, helps give me insider information into what my particular metabolic phenotype is. And so then I can align my strategies around it and ignore the rest. That's probably like the biggest gift that I would love to give people, is the empowerment to know what information is right for me and what information can I absolutely ignore and throw that out the window because of, while it may be well-intentioned, it's designed for someone else, it's not designed for me. Cool. I am not going to give the same advice to a postmenopausal woman as I am to a 25-year-old menstrual cycling woman. Like, two completely different metabolic phenotypes, and we need to be able to come to the table and like recognize that, right? So it's like, to me, if you're going to be working in health and hormones and nutrition, like you have to be able to talk about all of it, and you have to be able to talk about like the total body, not just one subset of any of that, because then you're missing the forest for the trees, right? And so you end up being a giant disservice to people. So determining your metabolic phenotype really is where those determining your metabolic phenotypes is really where those functional labs really shine. So if you've been through the ringer of some conventional labs, maybe some things were flagged, maybe some things came back completely normal, but your symptoms aren't normal. If you're interested in utilizing, like I said, some functional testing, that's completely available to you. Just make sure that you seek out a practitioner, unbiased, someone like myself, that can help you navigate that to a root cause measure, and not just like, oh, here's your test, here's some supplements, bye. It's like, that is not functional medicine. That's not functional testing. That is conventional medicine, only you're using supplements and not prescriptions. We're not helping people in that regard, and we're kind of like beautifully missing the mark. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, if you're struggling out there and you've been trying like all these different tools with well intentions and not seeing the success that you want, it's probably time to dig, because you're probably not aligning tools according to your particular metabolic phenotype. So very simple to do that. I say simple. Maybe I say like, there are capacities to understand that in a bigger sense than maybe what you've been provided in the past, is what I probably should put that way. It's just a matter of, like I said, digging in, finding that particular phenotype, and then feeling confident with the tools that align to that. So always feel free to either, like I said, shoot me a DM, leave me a comment here. If you're interested in diving into more of that or working with me more one-on-one, you would be a great candidate then for my Revive, Restore, Renew You program. You can click the link in my Instagram bio, and there's an application right there where you can apply for that program. I accept X amount of people per month depending on my current client load. And so if I'm not able to get you in this month, you can always wait on the wait list for the following month as well too. And that is going to be a great opportunity for us to dig into your metabolic phenotype and really feel what this feels like to actually align the proper nutrition, lifestyle, supplemental strategies to your body versus continuing to spin your wheels. So hopefully that was helpful for you guys. more conversations to come on this, because I feel like this individualized approach to medicine is only going to become a greater and greater need.